The first thing I noticed was the light. It was coming from an upstairs bedroom of a house that had supposedly been empty for almost 8 years. I was standing outside the property just before sunset, looking through the windshield of my car. The house was at the end of a narrow road surrounded by trees. There were no neighboring houses, no streetlights, no parked cars, just an old 2-story house sitting behind a rusted metal gate. I had been hired to photograph it for a real estate company. The job was supposed to be simple: photograph every room, document the condition of the property, get out. I had done this kind of work before. Old houses didn't bother me. Abandoned houses didn't bother me either. What bothered me was that upstairs window. It was glowing with a faint yellow light. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I checked the address on my phone. Same house, same number. I assumed someone from the real estate company must have been inside, so I got out of the car. The gate was unlocked. I pushed it open and walked toward the house. The front door was also unlocked. That seemed strange, but not strange enough to stop me. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the smell of decay. It was more like an old room that had been closed for years. Dust, damp wood, stale air. The furniture was still there: a sofa, a dining table, several old chairs. Everything was covered with white sheets. I switched on my camera and started taking pictures. The downstairs rooms were exactly what I expected. Old, empty, neglected, nothing moved, nothing made a sound. I photographed the kitchen, then the living room, then the dining room. After that, I found the staircase. I walked upstairs. There were 4 bedrooms, 3 of them were completely empty. The 4th was at the end of the hallway. Its door was closed. I opened it. The room was almost completely bare. There was only one wooden chair sitting in the middle. I remember thinking it was an odd place to leave a chair. I photographed it anyway. Then I noticed something. The curtains were closed. I pulled one of them aside. The window looked directly toward the driveway. From there I could see my car, nothing else. I took another photograph, then I left the room. As I walked back down the hallway, I noticed the upstairs light was still off. That was strange, because I could have sworn I'd seen a light coming from that exact window before entering the house. I didn't think much about it. I finished photographing the upstairs rooms and went back downstairs. It was around 6:30 in the evening. The sun was almost gone. I decided to finish quickly. That's when I heard footsteps. 1 floor above me. I stopped. The sound was faint. 1 step, then another, then another. Someone was walking across the upstairs hallway. I looked toward the staircase. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then I heard them again. This time they were slower. I immediately thought about the possibility that someone had entered the house without my knowing. I pulled out my phone and called the real estate agent. He answered after several rings. "Hey, I'm still at the property," I said. "Is anyone else supposed to be here?" There was a short pause. "No," I looked toward the staircase. "I just heard someone upstairs." Another pause, then his voice changed. "You're inside the house?" "Yes." He didn't respond for several seconds, then he said, "Leave." I thought I'd misheard him. "What? Just leave the property?" I asked him why. He wouldn't explain, he only repeated himself. "Take your camera and get outside." I started walking toward the front door, then I heard something upstairs, a door closing. I stopped. The sound came from the hallway. The agent was still on the phone. I lowered my voice. "Someone is definitely upstairs." This time he answered immediately. "I know." I felt a cold sensation run through my stomach. "What do you mean you know?" He didn't answer. I asked again. "Why would you tell me to leave if you knew someone was inside?" Finally, he sighed. Then he told me something I hadn't been told when I accepted the job. The house had been empty for years, but it had a history, not a supernatural one. At least that wasn't what he believed. People had been getting inside, over and over again. The previous owner had reported it several times. Police had searched the property. They never found anyone. The locks had been replaced. Windows had been boarded. Security cameras had been installed. But things kept changing inside the house. A chair would be moved. A photograph would disappear. A cabinet would be left open. Once, someone found fresh footprints in the dust upstairs, but there were no footprints leading into the house, only footprints inside it. The agent told me he believed someone had been secretly living there. I asked him how that was possible. He said there was a storage area beneath the staircase. During the last inspection, an employee had discovered a mattress inside, a blanket, several empty food containers, and a battery-powered lamp. I looked toward the hallway. The storage door was only a few feet away from me. I hadn't noticed it when I entered. There was a padlock hanging from it. I walked closer. The lock looked new, very new. I asked the agent if he had the key. No, then who locked it? He didn't answer. I stared at the padlock. Something about it bothered me. The rest of the house looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but that lock didn't. It was clean. The metal wasn't rusty. There were fresh scratches around the keyhole. Someone had been using it. I stepped closer. Then I heard something from behind the door, a faint sound, almost like fabric moving across the floor. I stepped backward. The agent immediately said, "Don't open it." I hadn't told him I was standing beside it. I asked how he knew. He said, "Because that's where they used to find things moved." I didn't understand. Then he explained, every time someone discovered the storage room, something inside had changed. The mattress would move, the lamp would be turned on, food would appear. Once there had been a fresh pair of shoes inside. The strange part was that nobody could figure out how the person was getting in. The windows were sealed, the doors were locked. There was no basement, no attic access, no tunnel, nothing. I started walking toward the front door again. I didn't care about the photographs anymore. I didn't care about the job, I just wanted to leave. I was almost at the entrance when I heard footsteps again. This time they were coming down the staircase. Slowly, one step at a time. I froze. The agent was still on the phone. "Are you outside?" "No." "Don't wait." I looked toward the staircase. I could see the first few steps, nothing else. Then another footstep, then another. Someone was coming down. I backed toward the front door. My hand was already on the handle. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited, nothing. I opened the door. Cold evening air rushed inside. I stepped outside. Then I heard something behind me, a quiet click. I turned. The storage room door was open, just a few inches. I stared at it. I knew I'd seen the padlock hanging there. Now it was lying on the floor. The agent heard my silence. "What happened?" I whispered. "The door is open." He immediately told me to leave. I did. I ran to my car, got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. Before driving away, I looked back at the house. The upstairs bedroom was dark. Every window was dark. The entire house looked completely empty. Then, just as I put the car into gear, the upstairs light came on, the same faint yellow light I'd noticed when I arrived. I watched the window. A few seconds passed. Then a figure walked across it. I couldn't see their face, only the outline of a person. They stopped in the middle of the window and stood there, looking directly toward my car. I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, the real estate agent called me. He didn't ask whether I was okay. He didn't ask what I had seen. He asked me one question. "Did you photograph the storage room?" I told him no. He said, "Check your camera." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. I opened the camera and started going through the photographs. There were 146 images. Kitchen, living room, dining room, bedrooms, hallway, staircase. I kept scrolling. Then I stopped. There was a photograph I didn't remember taking. It showed the upstairs hallway. The staircase was visible on the left. The storage room door was visible on the right, but something was wrong. The photograph wasn't taken from where I'd been standing. It had been taken from the far end of the hallway, and the timestamp said 2:13 a.m. I had left the property at 7:02 p.m. I stared at the screen, then I zoomed in. The storage room door was open and inside the room. Someone was sitting on the mattress. I couldn't see their face, but there was something sitting beside them, something I recognized immediately. My camera bag, the same camera bag I had been carrying when I left the house. I looked across my room. My camera bag was sitting on my desk, exactly where I had left it. Then I noticed something else in the photograph. The person sitting inside the storage room wasn't looking toward the camera. They were looking directly toward the hallway, as if they knew someone was standing there. And underneath the photograph was a second image, one I had never taken. It showed the same hallway, but this time, the person was standing and they were facing the camera. I didn't sleep that night. I kept going back to the photograph, the hallway, the open storage room door, and the person standing at the end of it. I zoomed in again. The image was blurry, but I could make out the outline of a man. He was wearing a dark jacket. His head was slightly lowered. His arms were hanging at his sides. And he was looking directly toward the camera. I checked the metadata. The photograph had been taken at 2:14 a.m., 1 minute after the previous photograph. I hadn't been anywhere near that house at 2:14 a.m. I hadn't even known the photograph existed until 3 days later. I called the real estate agent. He answered immediately. I saw it, I said. There was silence. Then he asked, did you see the second photograph? Yes. Another pause. Then he said, don't send those pictures to anyone. I asked why. He told me something he'd never mentioned during our first conversation. The previous owner had a son. His name was Daniel. Daniel had disappeared from the property years earlier. No dramatic circumstances, no police chase, no confirmed crime. He simply stopped answering his phone. His car was still outside. His wallet was still inside. His clothes were still in the house, but Daniel was gone. The family eventually reported him missing. The police searched the property. They found nothing. A few years later, the house was abandoned. I asked the agent why he thought Daniel had anything to do with the photographs. He said he didn't. He was simply telling me everything he knew. Then he asked me something. Did you see anyone when you arrived? I thought about it. No. Did you see anyone when you left? No. He was quiet. Then he said, that's what scares me. I asked what he meant. He told me the previous inspection had produced something similar. A contractor had taken photographs inside the house. Later that night, while reviewing them, he found a photograph that showed someone standing upstairs. The contractor swore nobody had been inside. The police were called. They searched the property again. Nothing, no person, no hidden entrance, no sign of anyone living there. But there was one detail that investigators couldn't explain. The figure in the photograph was standing beside the storage room door. The same door, the same hallway, the same position. I asked the agent if he still had that photograph. He said yes. Then he sent it to me. I opened the attachment. The photograph was old. The image quality was terrible, but the figure was unmistakable. Someone was standing in the hallway, and behind him was the storage room door. I stared at it. Then I noticed something. The person was wearing a dark jacket. The exact same style of jacket as the figure in my photograph. I asked the agent when the contractor had taken the picture. He gave me a date. It was 8 years earlier. The house had been empty ever since. That meant whoever appeared in my photograph wasn't simply someone who had broken into the property recently, or at least, there was no evidence proving that. I decided to go back, not because I wanted to, because I needed to know what I had photographed. I didn't tell the agent. I waited until the following afternoon. I brought a friend with me. We parked several hundred yards away and walked the rest of the way. The house looked different during the day, less frightening, almost ordinary. The front door was locked. The windows were still boarded. I walked around the property. There were no footprints, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. Then I noticed something beneath the staircase, a small rectangular vent. I hadn't noticed it during my first visit. It was covered with dust. I crouched down. There was a faint draft coming through it. I called my friend over. He knelt beside me. We both noticed the same thing. The air coming through the vent smelled fresh, not like the rest of the house. Like someone had recently been inside the wall. We looked around. The wooden panel beneath the staircase was slightly different from the surrounding boards. There were scratches around its edges. I pushed it. Nothing. I pushed harder. The panel moved. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, not a room, just enough space for pipes and electrical cables. But at the back was something unexpected. A small wooden door. It was barely 3 feet tall, and it had a brass handle. My friend looked at me. Neither of us said anything. I opened it. Behind the door was a narrow passage. It went deeper into the house. We followed it for several feet. Then we reached another wall. There was no way through, no hidden room, no secret staircase, nothing. But on the floor was a collection of objects, empty food containers, bottled water, old newspapers, a blanket. Someone had been using the crawl space recently. My friend called the police. We waited outside. When officers arrived, they searched the property. They found the crawl space. They found the objects, but they didn't find anyone. One officer told us the passage appeared to connect to an old maintenance area that had been sealed years ago. There was no exit. Whoever had been there would have had to enter through the house, but every door and window had been locked. The police took the objects as evidence. Before leaving, one of the officers asked me something. "Did you take photographs?" I said yes. He asked to see them. I showed him the photograph from 2:13 a.m., then the second photograph. He stared at the screen, he zoomed in, then he handed the phone back. He didn't say anything. I asked what was wrong. He said that person wasn't standing there. I thought he was saying the photograph was fake, but that wasn't what he meant. He said he had been inside that hallway during the search. There was no place for anyone to stand where the photograph showed the figure. The wall was too close, the angle didn't make sense. I asked him if he thought someone had edited the picture. He said that was possible, but he couldn't explain why the first photograph showed the storage room door open, because when the police arrived, the door was sealed shut. They had to break the lock to enter it. That detail bothered me more than anything else. I went home that evening. I copied every photograph from the camera onto my computer. Then I compared the timestamps. There were 3 photographs taken around the same time. 2:13, 2:14, 2:15. The first showed the storage room door open. The second showed the figure standing in the hallway. The third showed the hallway completely empty. But there was something in the third photograph that I hadn't noticed before. A small object sitting on the floor. I zoomed in. It was a brass key. The same type of key that had been found in the crawl space. I checked my camera bag. There was nothing inside. Then I checked the photograph again. The key wasn't there in the first image. It appeared in the third. I contacted the real estate agent one final time. I told him everything. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he asked me to meet him. We sat in a cafe the following morning. He brought an old folder with him. Inside were copies of the property's inspection reports. There were years of them. And almost every report contained the same complaint. Something had been moved, something had appeared, something had disappeared, but there was never enough evidence to prove anyone was living there. Then he showed me one final document. It was the police report from Daniel's disappearance. There was a handwritten note attached to it. The note had been written by Daniel's father. It said, "If Daniel comes back, don't let him inside." I asked why. The agent said nobody knew. Daniel had never been found. And that was the one part of the story nobody could explain. The property was eventually demolished. The real estate company decided it wasn't worth keeping. The house was torn down completely. The crawl space was destroyed. The storage room was gone. Everything disappeared beneath the construction equipment. I assumed that would finally end it. It didn't. About 6 months later, I received an envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was a photograph of the house taken from across the road. The house was being demolished. Heavy machinery was parked outside. The walls were partially collapsed, and in one remaining upstairs window, someone was standing there. The photograph wasn't taken by me. I checked the date. It had been taken the same day the demolition crew arrived. I looked at the figure for several minutes. Then I noticed something. The person was wearing the same dark jacket, the same one I'd seen in my photographs. I never found out who took that final picture, and I never found out whether the figure was actually a person. That's the only part of this story I still can't explain. Everything else eventually had an explanation. Someone had been using the crawl space. Someone had entered the property. Someone had moved things. Someone had been hiding there, but the photographs, especially the one taken at 2:14 a.m., don't fit. Because the person in that photograph was standing in a place where nobody could physically have been standing. And that's the part I think about whenever I look at that picture. Maybe there was an explanation, maybe there wasn't, but I know one thing: I never photographed an empty house. I photographed a house that someone had been occupying. I just never found out who. That was the end of this story. If you've ever experienced something you still can't explain or have a strange story of your own, send it to Tales of the Dark. Your story could become the next nightmare featured on this channel. If you are new here, subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare.